December 8, 1941, Central Pacific Ocean. The ocean is calm. Too calm. The smoke of Pearl Harbor still hangs in the distance, drifting above shattered docks and burning hulls. Oil slicks stain the water black. The sound of explosions has faded, replaced by an uneasy silence broken only by the low thrum of engines somewhere beyond the horizon. Far from the wreckage, a single American aircraft carrier cuts through the Pacific swell. Her deck is empty, her aircraft secured, her crew alert but quiet. No celebration, no speeches, only preparation. She was not in the harbor when the bombs fell. By chance, or timing, she survived the opening blow of the war. Now she sails into something far larger than a single attack. The men aboard do not yet know how long the war will last. They do not know how many of them will survive it. They only know that the Pacific is vast, the enemy relentless, and that from this moment forward, there will be no safe waters. This ship will fight in more battles than any other American warship of the conflict. She will be damaged, burned, and hunted. She will return to combat again and again. And across the Pacific, enemy commanders will come to recognize her silhouette and fear it. Because this ship will earn a reputation no steel hull was ever meant to carry. The most dangerous American warship of World War II. And that reputation begins with the world that made her necessary. The war did not begin in the Pacific with airplanes over Pearl Harbor. It began years earlier, in conference rooms, shipyards, and classrooms where naval officers argued over the future of war at sea. After the First World War, the world's great powers believed they understood naval dominance. Steel ruled the oceans. Big guns decided empires. Battleships, floating fortresses with armor measured in feet, were seen as the final word in maritime power. Treaties attempted to freeze this belief into place. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the London Naval Treaty that followed were meant to prevent another ruinous arms race. They limited tonnage. They capped gun sizes. They defined how many capital ships each nation could build. On paper, these agreements preserved peace. In reality, they forced innovation into narrow channels. Aircraft carriers were considered secondary weapons, useful, perhaps, for reconnaissance. A support arm for the battleship line. Even many admirals viewed them as fragile experiments, too vulnerable, too dependent on weather, too complex to replace big gun doctrine. But technology does not wait for consensus. During the interwar years, aircraft improved rapidly, engines became more reliable, bomb loads increased, navigation improved, and somewhere over calm seas and open decks, pilots learned something battleship officers struggled to accept: range mattered more than armor. An aircraft could strike beyond the horizon. A carrier could bring that aircraft anywhere. Japan understood this earlier than most. As an island nation with limited resources, Japan studied naval aviation intensely. Its officers embraced long-range strikes, massed air power, and coordinated attacks. Their carrier pilots trained relentlessly, practicing torpedo drops and dive bombing with precision. The Imperial Japanese Navy built doctrine around speed, surprise, and decisive first blows. The United States Navy was slower to adapt, but not blind. American naval thinkers were divided. Traditionalists defended the battleship. Reformers argued for carriers. War games at the Naval War College explored hypothetical conflicts across the Pacific, conflicts that looked uncomfortably like what was coming. Those exercises revealed hard truths. The Pacific was vast beyond imagination. Supply lines would be long. Bases would be scarce. Any war against Japan would not be a single decisive clash. It would be a grinding campaign measured in distance, logistics, and endurance. Carriers offered mobility, flexibility, reach. But even among carrier advocates, there was uncertainty. How many planes were enough? How much armor could a carrier afford? Could a carrier survive being hit? These questions were not theoretical for long. By the late 1930s, tensions across the Pacific tightened. Japan expanded into China, Western embargoes followed, diplomacy narrowed, fleets repositioned. The United States Navy began to prepare, not for a single battle, but for a war that would stretch across years and oceans. And in American shipyards, a new generation of carriers was already taking shape. Larger, faster, designed not as auxiliaries but as central weapons. Among them was one ship that would enter service just as the world tipped into global war. Not yet famous, not yet feared, but built for a kind of conflict no navy had ever fully experienced. And as the treaties faded and the last illusions of restraint collapsed, that ship would soon be tested in ways its designers could never simulate. Because the old world of naval warfare was ending, and the carrier age was about to be baptized in fire. The ship was laid down before the world accepted what she would become. In 1934, at the Newport News shipbuilding yard in Virginia, the keel of a new aircraft carrier was placed into the dry dock. She belonged to the Yorktown class, a design shaped by treaty limits and hard compromise. Every ton mattered. Every decision balanced armor against speed, protection against striking power. Her name was USS Enterprise. At 809 feet long, she was not the largest carrier ever conceived. Her armor was modest by battleship standards. Her true strength lay elsewhere, in the open steel of her flight deck, the hangar beneath it, and the aviation fuel lines that made her both powerful and dangerously vulnerable. She was launched in October 1936 and commissioned into the United States Navy on May 12, 1938. From the beginning, Enterprise represented a shift in thinking. She carried close to 90 aircraft in various configurations, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Her air group could strike targets hundreds of miles away. Her speed, over 32 knots, allowed her to maneuver independently of the battle line, to choose when to engage or withdraw. But none of this guaranteed survival. Carriers were fragile by nature. They burned easily. One well-placed bomb could ignite fuel, detonate ordnance, and turn a flight deck into an inferno. Early carrier doctrine accepted this risk as unavoidable. Enterprise's early years were spent in training and experimentation. Fleet exercises tested coordination between ships and aircraft. Pilots practiced deck landings in rough seas. Damage control teams drilled endlessly, knowing that fire, not flooding, would be their greatest enemy. In 1940 and 1941, as war spread across Europe and Asia, Enterprise operated increasingly in the Pacific. She ferried aircraft to distant bases. She patrolled tense waters. Her crew grew accustomed to long deployments and uncertain horizons. The ship's culture took shape quietly. Enterprise's crew was a mixture of seasoned sailors and young recruits, many barely out of training. Pilots rotated in and out, each bringing new tactics and hardened lessons. There was no sense yet that this carrier would become exceptional. She was simply one of several fleet carriers, important but not unique. That illusion would not survive the war's first year. On December 7, 1941, Enterprise was returning to Pearl Harbor after delivering Marine aircraft to Wake Island. Her planes were scheduled to land at Ford Island that morning. They never made it. As Japanese carrier aircraft struck the harbor, Enterprise was still at sea. Her scouts encountered enemy planes over Oahu. Shots were exchanged. Confusion spread through the task force as reports arrived of battleships burning and airfields destroyed. Enterprise had escaped destruction by timing alone. Within hours, she was at war. The following days exposed a brutal reality. The battleships of the Pacific Fleet were crippled or sunk. The carriers, Enterprise among them, were now the primary offensive weapon of the United States Navy. There was no time to ease into this role. Enterprise would sail into combat with incomplete intelligence, limited escorts, and an enemy whose skill and confidence were at their peak. There would be no controlled tests, no gradual escalation. Only real battles, real losses, real consequences. And with every sortie launched from her deck, Enterprise would begin to earn a reputation, not through design or intention, but through survival. Because in the Pacific War, staying afloat long enough to fight again would become a form of dominance. And Enterprise was about to be tested in a way no American warship ever had before. War at sea is often described in terms of steel and statistics. For the men aboard Enterprise, it was lived in exhaustion, heat, and routine danger. The flight deck was the most dangerous workplace in the U.S. Navy. Aircraft engines screamed at full throttle only feet from sailors getting them forward. Propellers turned the air into invisible blades. A single mistake, a loose chock, a misunderstood hand signal could kill a man instantly. During combat operations, the danger multiplied. Planes returned damaged, leaking fuel, trailing smoke. Landings were rushed. The deck never stopped moving. Below deck, the hangar was a confined world of fuel vapors and suspended ordnance. Bombs and torpedoes were moved by hand. Fires were a constant threat. Damage control teams drilled obsessively because they had seen what happened to carriers that failed to contain flames. Enterprise's crew learned quickly. Early engagements in 1942 exposed how unforgiving carrier warfare truly was. There were no second chances in the air. Pilots launched knowing many would not return. Those who did often carried the memory of empty formation slots where friends had been only hours before. Tactically, Enterprise operated as part of fast-moving task forces. Speed was protection, maneuver was survival. The carrier rarely stayed in one place for long. She struck and withdrew, repositioned, refueled at sea, launched again. This rhythm shaped her crew's mindset. Sleep came in fragments, meals were rushed, days blurred together. Combat air patrols launched before dawn, recovery operations continued into darkness. The ship never truly rested. Enterprise's aviators became aggressive by necessity. There was no margin for hesitation when facing Japanese Zero fighters or heavy anti-aircraft fire. Dive bombers pushed their attacks to dangerously low altitudes. Torpedo squadrons flew straight into defensive fire knowing their odds. Losses were expected, but never accepted lightly. Each missing aircraft forced a recalculation. Each loss strained morale, and yet the carrier kept operating. Enterprise's tactical flexibility made her dangerous. Her air group adapted rapidly. Fighters shifted from escort to interception. Bombers adjusted attack profiles. Radar, still primitive, began to influence combat decisions, allowing earlier warnings and faster reactions than many enemy forces could manage. But adaptability came at a cost. Enterprise was hit more than once. Bombs penetrated decks. Fires raged. Casualties mounted. The ship survived not because she was invulnerable, but because her crew responded faster, worked longer, and refused to abandon the fight. Damage control teams fought fires while aircraft still landed overhead. Medical crews treated wounded in passageways thick with smoke. Officers made decisions with incomplete information and no time to debate. This was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was grim, methodical, relentless. And as Enterprise continued to return from battles others did not, something began to change. The crew noticed it first. They began to believe, quietly, that their ship could take punishment and keep fighting. That belief did not make them reckless. It made them determined. Because in a war where carriers vanished in minutes, endurance itself became a weapon. And that endurance would soon be tested not just by human limits, but by an enemy watching closely, learning which American carrier refused to die. Enterprise did not become feared because she was perfect. She became feared because she evolved faster than the war around her. Technology aboard the carrier changed continuously. Radar sets were upgraded and repositioned. Early warning ranges improved by miles, then tens of miles. These extra minutes allowed fighters to be launched sooner, interceptions to be coordinated more effectively, and surprise to be reduced. never eliminated, but blunted. Aircraft changed as well. Early war fighters gave way to more capable designs with heavier armament and better survivability. Dive bombers improved accuracy through hardened experience. Torpedo tactics were rewritten after early failures. Each adjustment reflected lessons paid for in blood. Leadership played a critical role. Enterprise was commanded by officers who understood carrier warfare not as static doctrine, but as a living system. Command decisions emphasized flexibility and decentralization. Pilots were trusted to adapt in the air. Task force commanders repositioned aggressively, often accepting risk to gain initiative. This culture encouraged innovation under pressure. The carrier's operations became increasingly coordinated with other fleet elements, destroyers screening against submarines, cruisers providing anti-aircraft fire, logistics ships enabling extended operations far from base. Enterprise rarely fought alone, but her presence often anchored the task force's striking power. From the enemy's perspective, Enterprise became something else entirely. Japanese intelligence tracked American carriers carefully. Losses at Coral Sea and Midway had reduced the number of experienced Japanese aviators and carriers. Each surviving U.S. carrier, therefore, carried disproportionate strategic weight. Enterprise appeared repeatedly. After Pearl Harbor, after early raids, after battles where other carriers were sunk or withdrawn. Japanese reports began to note a carrier that seemed unusually persistent, damaged yet operational, struck yet returned. Its aircraft reappeared over contested waters again and again. This repetition mattered. In naval warfare, uncertainty breeds caution. Japanese planners could not assume Enterprise was out of the fight even after scoring hits. That forced more conservative estimates, more defensive preparations, more hesitation at critical moments. Fear in this context was not panic, it was respect. Enterprise's growing radar capability complicated Japanese air attacks. Fighters were vectored more efficiently. Surprise was harder to achieve. Loss rates increased. Attacks that might have overwhelmed earlier carrier defenses now faced layered resistance. Meanwhile, Enterprise continued to strike. Her air groups targeted carriers, cruisers, airfields, supply routes. Each mission degraded Japanese operational capacity. Each survival reinforced her reputation. The carrier's black hull and island silhouette became recognizable. Japanese pilots reported attacking her by name. Damage assessments sometimes overestimated her destruction, only for her to reappear weeks later. This psychological effect cannot be measured precisely, but its presence is evident in post-war analysis. Enterprise was no longer just a ship. She was a known quantity, a persistent threat, a variable that refused to be removed from the equation. And as the Pacific War reached its most critical phase, all of these elements, technology, leadership, endurance, and enemy perception, would converge in battles where a single carrier's survival would influence the fate of fleets. Because the moment was coming when Enterprise would stand at the center of decisions that determined who controlled the Pacific. And once that moment arrived, there would be no margin left for error. The year was 1942. For the United States Navy, it was the most dangerous year of the war. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, Japan advanced rapidly. Guam fell. Wake Island was overrun. The Philippines were collapsing. Japanese carrier forces, experienced, confident, and lethal, roamed the Pacific largely unchallenged. Enterprise was already in motion. In February, her aircraft struck the Marshall Islands, one of the first American offensive actions of the war. The raids were limited in scale, but strategically significant. They signaled that American carriers could reach deep into Japanese-held territory and survive the return journey. But these were only preludes. The true test came in May and June, as intelligence intercepts hinted at a decisive Japanese operation. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii began piecing together fragments of enemy communications. An attack was coming. Its target appeared to be Midway Island. If Midway fell, the Pacific balance would tilt sharply. Enterprise sailed north with Task Force 16, joined by USS Hornet. USS Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, was hastily repaired and added to the force. Together, they formed a fragile American counterpunch. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. Enterprise's aircraft launched early, searching vast stretches of ocean with incomplete information. Fuel was limited. Coordination was imperfect. Some squadrons became separated. Torpedo planes attacked without fighter cover and were slaughtered. But sacrifice created opportunity. As Japanese fighters were drawn low, Enterprise's dive bombers arrived from altitude. In minutes, they struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, turning flight decks into burning wreckage. It was one of the most decisive moments in naval history. Enterprise was targeted in return. Japanese counterattacks followed. Bombs fell close. Near misses rocked the ship. Damage was contained. She remained operational. By the end of the battle, 4 Japanese carriers were lost. The strategic initiative shifted. But Midway did not end the war. It merely exposed how brutal the next phase would be. As fighting moved south toward the Solomon Islands, Enterprise again found herself at the center of events. In August, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. Japanese naval power surged to contest the landings. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Enterprise launched strikes that damaged the Japanese carrier Ryujo. Enemy aircraft retaliated. This time, Enterprise was hit. 3 bombs struck the ship, fires erupted, casualties were taken, 1 elevator was destroyed, the flight deck was scarred and twisted. Yet within hours, damage control teams had contained the fires. Within days, Enterprise was back at sea. In October, at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, she faced another carrier clash. USS Hornet was sunk. Enterprise was again hit by bombs, twice. Smoke poured from her decks. Fires burned dangerously close to aviation fuel. Casualties mounted. Still, she survived. By the end of 1942, Enterprise was the only operational American fleet carrier in the Pacific. Alone, but not idle. Her continued presence prevented Japanese forces from achieving decisive control. Her aircraft contested airspace, struck supply lines, and supported Guadalcanal through its darkest hours. This was the year that defined her reputation. Hit, repaired, returned. Again and again. And as the Pacific War ground forward, both sides understood a hard truth. If Enterprise could be sunk, the balance might still shift. If she survived, the outcome was beginning to look inevitable. And the war was far from finished. By 1943, the Pacific War no longer moved in sudden leaps. It advanced through pressure. Enterprise returned to combat after repairs, her hull scarred and her crew changed. Veterans were replaced by new faces. Experience accumulated unevenly. Losses were absorbed, but never forgotten. The character of the war evolved. Japanese carrier strength had been shattered, but not eliminated. Land-based air power, submarines, and increasingly desperate tactics replaced the massed carrier strikes of early 1942. Enterprise adapted again. Night operations became routine. Radar allowed American carriers to detect incoming aircraft in darkness. Fighters were launched into black skies, guided by voice and instruments alone. These missions were exhausting and dangerous, but they reduced Japanese effectiveness and protected vital amphibious operations. Enterprise supported the long struggle for Guadalcanal's surrounding seas, then shifted north and west as Allied strategy pushed toward Japan's inner defenses. She covered landings, struck airfields, and hunted shipping. In November 1943, during operations around the Gilbert Islands, Enterprise introduced a new concept, the first carrier-based night fighter squadron in U.S. Navy history. It was a quiet revolution. Darkness, once protection for attackers, became another domain contested. By 1944, the scale of American industrial output was unmistakable. New carriers joined the fleet, task forces expanded. Enterprise was no longer alone, but she remained central. Her experience shaped doctrine, her crews trained newcomers, her methods became standard. Then came a new threat. As American forces closed on the Philippines and Japan's defensive perimeter collapsed, Japanese pilots began adopting suicide tactics. Kamikaze attacks transformed the nature of carrier defense. Speed and armor mattered less than reaction time and damage control. Enterprise was hit again. In April 1945, off Okinawa, a kamikaze aircraft struck her flight deck. Explosions tore through the structure. Fires spread. Casualties were severe. For the first time in her career, Enterprise was forced to withdraw from frontline operations. It was not defeat, it was exhaustion. The ship had survived nearly 4 years of continuous combat. She had been present at almost every major carrier battle in the Pacific. She had absorbed more damage than any other American carrier and remained afloat. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Enterprise was undergoing repairs. She would not participate in the final victory celebrations at sea. Her war was already over. But the momentum she helped create could not be reversed. The Carrier Task Force, once an experiment, had become the decisive instrument of naval power. Battleships now escorted carriers. Aircraft defined the battle space. Enterprise had lived through the transition. From uncertain experiment to proven dominance. And with the guns finally silent, the war moved into its final accounting, measured not in battles won, but in cost, consequence, and memory. Survival came at a high price. Enterprise had carried more than 2,500 officers and enlisted men in her air groups and ship's company over the course of the war. Many served multiple deployments. Casualties mounted with every engagement. At Midway, Guadalcanal, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, dozens of her sailors were killed, scores more wounded. Pilots vanished over the open ocean, never to be recovered. The ship herself bore the scars of near-constant combat. By late 1944, Enterprise had been struck by bombs at least 7 times, suffered torpedo near misses, and endured repeated kamikaze strikes. Her flight deck was repeatedly repaired, reinforced, and patched. Bulkheads bore the marks of explosions, and fire-damaged steel had been replaced by emergency welds and makeshift reinforcements. Every repair told a story of endurance, improvisation, and the relentless demand of operational necessity. Logistics were a hidden battle. Supplying fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement aircraft was a continuous struggle. The Pacific theater's vast distances meant that Enterprise often operated at the extreme range of supply lines. Her ability to strike repeatedly depended not just on her design, but on the coordination of the entire U.S. Navy's logistical network, tankers, supply ships, and repair yards. Morale fluctuated under pressure. The ship's veterans had witnessed the deaths of friends and colleagues. Each new crew rotation brought inexperienced men into an environment where error could be fatal. Yet the sense of purpose, of being at the center of decisive naval operations, sustained them. Letters from home, brief shore leave, and small moments of camaraderie became essential to survival as much as drills and orders. Strategically, Enterprise's continued operations had a profound effect. The Japanese Navy, though still formidable, could not ignore a carrier that repeatedly struck their positions, survived multiple attacks, and returned to fight. Her presence forced the enemy to disperse forces, delay operations, and overestimate American strength. Enterprise's endurance allowed the U.S. Navy to maintain pressure across multiple fronts, buying time for additional carriers to arrive and gradually shift the balance of power. By the end of 1944, Enterprise had traveled more than 280,000 miles in combat conditions, equivalent to circumnavigating the globe more than 11 times. She had launched thousands of aircraft sorties, and her air groups had destroyed countless enemy planes, ships, and supply installations. The cost, measured in lives, labor, and steel, was immense, but it was also the measure of why Enterprise became feared. Not because she was invulnerable, but because she kept fighting when others could not. And yet, even in survival, there was a quiet recognition of limitation. Every strike, every repair, every exhausted crew member was a reminder that endurance was finite. The next hit could have ended her career, and the war might have looked very different if it had. This grim calculus defined her final years in combat. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its final stages. The Japanese defensive perimeter was collapsing, Iwo Jima had fallen, Okinawa was under assault, yet Enterprise, the ship that had earned a reputation as the most dangerous American warship, was no longer on the front lines. Her flight deck, once the launching point for waves of aircraft, had been repeatedly scarred by bombs and kamikazes. Steel reinforcements held her together, but the relentless strain had taken its toll. The men aboard, some veterans of every major carrier engagement, were weary, battle-hardened, and small in number compared to the mass of sailors now training to carry the war to Japan. Enterprise did not join the final carrier strikes on the Japanese home islands. Instead, she underwent extensive repairs and upgrades in San Francisco. Her crew trained new aviators, prepared aircraft, and ensured that her experience was preserved for the final phases of naval strategy. She was a mentor, a repository of knowledge, and a living testament to the endurance of the U.S. Navy's carrier force. When the news of Japan's surrender reached the Pacific, Enterprise was anchored safely, far from combat. She had survived every major carrier battle from Midway to Okinawa, her contribution decisive yet quietly acknowledged. Unlike other ships celebrated in immediate victory parades, Enterprise's recognition came through citations, decorations, and the record of every sortie flown from her decks. She had become legendary not for spectacle, but for relentless, effective action under conditions that would have destroyed lesser ships. Official records confirm her impact. Enterprise participated in more major actions than any other American warship in World War II, and her air groups destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other carrier. Yet when the war ended, she was not preserved as a museum or national monument. Her steel would eventually be scrapped, her decks dismantled. The world remembered the victories, but the vessel itself, silent and scarred, was gone. Her legacy, however, endured. Enterprise had proven the aircraft carrier was the decisive instrument of naval power, shifting naval doctrine permanently away from battleship dominance. The Pacific theater had been won through mobility, endurance, and strategic reach, qualities embodied by this single ship and her crew. And as the smoke of war cleared across the vast Pacific, one truth remained. The most dangerous American warship had survived the unimaginable, not through invulnerability, but through persistence, adaptability, and the courage of those who sailed her. Her story was complete, but the lessons she embodied would shape naval strategy for generations to come. Enterprise's story is more than a chronicle of battles, bomb hits, and aircraft sorties. It is a study of endurance, adaptation, and the human capacity to persist in conditions of extreme danger. She survived where others fell, not because she was invincible, but because her crew, her technology, and her leadership continually adapted to the evolving challenges of modern naval warfare. The Pacific War transformed the nature of naval conflict. Battleships, once the arbiters of power at sea, became secondary instruments. Aircraft carriers, mobile and flexible, defined strategy, dictated engagements, and extended influence across thousands of miles. Enterprise exemplified this transformation. She was not the largest or most armored vessel, but she was the most effective. Her presence reshaped enemy planning, forced strategic adjustments, and demonstrated that survival under fire could itself be a decisive weapon. Yet amid the steel and smoke, the human element remains central. Every sortie, every fire contained, every emergency repair performed in the heat of combat speaks to the courage, skill, and endurance of the sailors who lived through it. Their lives, intertwined with the ships, made Enterprise more than steel and engines. She became a symbol of persistence, of the relentless will to fight even against overwhelming odds. History remembers outcomes. Battles are measured in numbers, victories in territory gained or ships sunk. But Enterprise reminds us that endurance, adaptability, and the determination of those who serve can alter the course of events in ways that pure firepower cannot. Her legacy is not simply that she survived, but that she defined a new paradigm in naval warfare, one in which agility, intelligence, and human resilience became as lethal as any gun. In the quiet after the guns fell silent, Enterprise's story remains a testament. The deadliest American warship of World War II was not invincible, but unyielding. Her shadow lingers not on the decks of modern ships, but in the doctrine, courage, and ingenuity of every sailor who follows in her wake.